Between the time when chaos broke Cadia and the return of the sons of the Emperor, there was an age undreamed of. And unto this, Kronan, wearer of the jeweled crown of Aquilonia, upon a troubled brow. It is I, his chronicler, who alone can tell thee of his saga. Let me tell you of the days of high adventure. Kronan and the Smelldar Pirate Prince, Part 1. Now do remember to leave a hearty digit upwards or a truly orky comment, as this one has a voting opportunity in it. Oh yes, it does. For the narrator, or something like that. For your tubes, a very tricky, and otherwise, who will hear the glory of the cunning one? Nobody, that's who. So, if you love the tales of high adventure, do hit me up, or share it out there amongst the grots and snots. It's educational, don't you know? And so it was that we rejoin our hero, Kronan, lord of all of Aquilonia, big boss of the entire cunning Waaagh. And what a day it was. Some time after where we had left him, if truth be told. Yet that is the best way to begin a chronicle, in medias res, or something like that. For Kronan awoke from his slumber, and verily, he leapt from his bedroll with a spring and a flourish. He positively bounced to his ablutions, jumping up and slapping a few of the hanging grots in his tactical simulation floating mobile in his elation. He had a very satisfying movement, then on to arranging his hair squigs with the brush of his palm. Being as loyal as any other part of the Waaagh, the hair squigs parted perfectly and made him look as epic on the outside as he felt on the inside. Not that Kronan did a lot of searching around inside himself. Well, apart from when he took out his emergency field generator and let Tiddles give it a quick lick clean. But that was incredibly infrequently. And nary did he have the time to do any self-reflection. Well, more than looking to see if his hair squigs were obeying his wishes, which, as we have heard, they always did. Kronan slammed open the doors to his inner sanctum, and his guards snapped to attention, meaning they snapped whatever they were tinkering or playing with, and gave him their full attention. The cunning one did not like to wait about, and these days he was an orc possessed. Never had any seen him so jaunty, not even in the old days of his first steps on the meandering to power, did Kronan seem so electrified. Okay, sometimes this was due to an internal short, and a few wormies of power crackling out and demi-frying him. But mostly, this was due to his left arm tinkering about when he was not looking. Turning things on and off, well, when he was wearing his super mega shiny armor, at the least. So, Kronan was known to go about without it most of the time. And few took him any less seriously, as they had all witnessed, quite frequently and regularly actually, due to the mystery of truth, his ability to scrap, even in the buff. Had he not slain Tooth Smasher while wearing only a long cloth, or something like that. Anyways, Kronan was about his business with gusto, as he practically tap danced his way to the bridge of the Orcs of Omen, ready to read the reports of the day. And he was not disappointed. The rest of the Waaagh was in fine fettle again. The deck crew leered at him as he bounced through the doors and took reports, before ascending the 20 stairs up to his command thong. Sat there, he began to chortle at the most up-to-date battle reports. Oddly, for any other race in the entire Milky Way galaxy, the elan of the entire Orc formation was through the roof. Now, what was odd about this particular set of circumstances was the absolute kicking that the Waaagh fleets, their starships, had received for the last month or so. I mean, anyone else would be holding doleful, melancholy meetings with lots of self-recrimination about their tragic and near-total lack of progress and cataclysmic losses for bugger all in return. Meetings possibly terminated by the sound of a darker shot going through the back of the highest-ranking officer's head when the doors had just closed. Well, in those cultures where honour was still a thing, I suppose. but not the greenskins. For they were the worshippers of the true gods, Waaagh, and, most importantly here, the lord of cunning brutality, Mork. For Mork was the patron god of Kronan and the entire Waaagh. But they were truly enlightened and believed in the both of them, of course. Nor was that the end of the matter, but that is for later, so let us push on. In any case, this was certainly not how things were playing out in the Waaagh, for they were having a whale of a time. They had been shot down, shaken, and stair-sheep sunk for weeks unending, all while the enemy slipped away and rarely had the courtesy to stick around to take their lumps in return. Others might have given up. Others might have plotted a course around the region. Others might have slunk off and wept about it, but not the greenskins. No, this was the most fun they had had in ages. Now it could indeed be vexing when the Smelldar turned tail and fled, but all were grinning and laughing as they did. For all, deep down in the core of their being, they knew that Kronan would lead them to victory. And it was such a great lark. For what some might not understand about the orcs is that they don't actually want a walkover. Where the pathetic worshippers of the juice god might not care where the scrap came from. Where the forces of the gaudy emperor were looking for a quick and decisive but easily won fray. And where the Smelldar wished for high glory but very few casualty events. This was not the yearning of the greenskins. Where was the fun in duffing over someone who was half your size or ability? Okay, there could be some titillating moments where you get your personal best scores for a scrap, but did they even count if the participants were weedy? Few believed this was so. Thus, the orcs were far more interested in a good hard fight. Now, this had not actually been in much supply of late. The slaughter of Toba and his vile red orcs was more like a walkover due to the numbers. Yet, it was a holy event and had to occur. But the actual shooting and stabbing were over rather quickly, to be fair, and the arse-starters had been a worthy foe. Yet, there had been so few of them present that it didn't last for nearly long enough to truly satisfy the boys, and definitely not enough for the cunning ones' taste. The battle with the Toe Empire and the sentient Psychopherne had been all darker little chopper action. It was okay, they guessed. Yet, it had been some time since the last real fight. The bashing and slashing of the buggins on the Orcs of Omens. Now that one indeed had been fun, but again, so few could get involved that it seemed semi-elitist in some regards. So, this one was very satisfying for all, as it was indeed a horrific Barney of legendary grandeur. And this was no surprise at all, for these were not crafty world Smelldar, no. These were the Smelldar Corsairs, the toughest and most coarse of all Smelldar sheeps and their commanders, and even amongst their kind, the piratical forces of Yain's Blonde were legendary. These were the best of their kind, and by Mork's raucous rump were they surprisingly and satisfyingly fighty. Sidebar: the Smelldar fleet. Now it is a rare being that knows the secret history of the Corsair fleets. Even Kronan was not aware of this matter, as it was not denoted in his data slate, which of course we will get to anon. For the Smelldar Corsair ships were actually the original Smelldar fleet. When most of their delinquent race were lolling about on a huge magic mushrooms and imbibing them as much as often, or were wading knee-deep in the juices of their own depravity and performing acts that required great athletic prowess, but sickeningly few morals. It was the rarely stable who either left their empire's worlds in massive crafty worlds to ply the stairs and trade doilies wherever they went, or something like that. Also, the right nutters who purposefully slunk back into a tree-hugging existence. These were called the exobites, and they just lounged about at the very edges of the galaxy. Yet, there was one group that were not religious nutbars or ravening crochet buffs, and these were the Smelldar Corsair fleets. Their name must have evolved from their lack of provisions, like body-enriching hairspray, one might presume. But in reality, any Smelldar that was more concerned about dishing out whoop than self-maintaining their quiffs and golden locks were to be considered to be a threat indeed. And the Corsairs were the most adept at void warfare as was possible, for they had maintained not only the gear, their powerful stair-sheeps, but also the discipline and centre to make best use of them. In other words, the Corsairs did not fuck about, and they were the truest sons of Eldernesh there ever was. Well, since Adrasta went AWOL anyways. End sidebar. And they were exactly what Kronan and his Waaagh had required at exactly the time they needed it. For Kronan, Admirals Hackbar, Grandmouth Tartan, and Dacher von Smashhoven all agreed. If they could trounce the Smelldar in the void, then they could literally take on anyone or anything. And so it was that they went about the learning at a colossal rate of absorption. Well, not that they had much choice in the matter, really. The lessons most often being the slow twisting of burnt-out hulks, cruisers, escorts, and battleships. Yet, with each engagement, the cunning one was growing. He knew it would not take long. Yet, most would have thought and almost prayed for it to be quicker. Not so the greenskin leadership. They really enjoyed every second of it all. For the lesser orcs, this was a true Barney, something to write home about. Not that any of them would put it that way. Mostly because none but the mech boys could write, and also because none of the orcs had left more than a scant skeleton crew left on the worlds that they had conquered thus far, let alone on Orquilonia itself. Now that isn't to say that there was no activity in the stair system of Kronan and the Waagh's birth, Orquilonia, for nothing could be further from the truth in this regard. Despite his moving the vast majority of the Waaagh from its origin and out into the wilds of space, Kronan had left a segment of his boys and sheeps there, and they were very busy indeed. For they were out in the many asteroid belts around the worlds and in the darkest outskirts of the place. Millions of orcs were completing one project, the creation of a vast array of rocks and, of course, more kill cruisers. But there were even more of them now, as Kronan had come up with another wee additional task. Well, to define it thus is far from truthful really, so I shall amend it. For as each kill cruiser or rock was completed, the remaining boys and mechs were reallocated to Kronan's new secret project. A plan so cunning, only a few of his inner circle even knew about it. Yes, that cunning. And it was to be a game changer when they finally reached the mega bundle they were all heading towards, or at least, so Kronan thought, or hoped even. But if things did go tits up, then Kronan had a perfect fall guy to throw in the way of any potential backlash. Ha! I know, I am teasing you, gentle listener, but some things are not to be revealed too early. You see, it all began one day when Kronan was perusing his beloved data slate. As usual, he had done preparation work before he embarked on this particular leg of his, legend, and he had indeed looked up details that might be held about the Smelldar, which of course we shall get to in due course. Yet, Kronan was smacked across the gob with a very rare flash of ideas, and his fingers slipped across the screens and brought up the one thing he had never thought to look up before: his own people. What did the Humies think of? The greenskins, the orcs. And he was amazed. He read for days uninterrupted, and he came to the single conclusion. Bastards. Little handle-tugging bastards. The sheer cheek of it all. Well, to be frank or earnest, they weren't too far off the mark most of the time. Yet, upon absorbing its contents thus far, he could now see the sense in what he had witnessed before. He now knew what the Humies had always been up to. The culls, to keep the Orky numbers down. the bombs, the burning where possible. They knew too much. Yet, despite this, despite underestimating the orcs frequently, and despite owning most of the worlds in the skies, the Humies feared the orcs. And Kronan investigated why. They were indeed most unpleasant in their view of the glory of the greenskins. Yet, they recorded when they had been spanked by them also. And Kronan now looked onto the data slate and read about other Waaghs. How they had attacked, what they achieved, how they failed, how they were finally stopped. And Kronan was enlightened. But bugger, thought Kronan initially, because many an assault would do exactly what he believed he would do in the same circumstances. Well, if he was not a practitioner of the dark arts. And so it was that Kronan absorbed these details like a squig snaffling handles from Humie corpses. Then he read ancient segments of the data slate, and more about a beast, and a new thing, something he now wanted more than anything he had ever seen. Well, apart from perhaps, just perhaps, the gold ones, but this new thing, he wanted at least one, at the very minimum. Thus, every last boy was sent to work on the new thing. Oh, yes they were. And Kronan had a new role model. Oh, he would always be like unto a star-struck youth at the mere mention of Gazgul, the prophet of Gork. Yet, he felt he could learn as much from this other hero of Orkidom, this beast. And when he was ready, he then took all of this information, all of these details, and discussed them with Eyes-Up Newtone and Grandmouth Tartan. Before long, he had bedazzled them so much that the Grandmouth had almost believed that this was his idea in the first instance, and Eyes-Up was, well, he was ensorcelled. His mind went into so much activity that Kronan and Tartan could practically hear the gears moving around in his head as his slack-jawed saliva pooled beneath him. Kronan broke this reverie and asked Eyes-Up if it was possible. And so, Eyes-Up nodded in the affirmative with such vigour and joy that his head near came off. Thus, work was now afoot on this secret project, which they all agreed would be called the Tartan Doctrine, whatever that meant. And if things turned out to be a total balls-up, and ended a crapper plan than walking up to a Sororitas Abbey with a party-sized pot of yogurt and requesting an orgy, then Tartan could take the fall. If things turned out as Kronan and Eyes-Up hoped, then Kronan could just reveal that it was his idea, and it was his toy, and thus gain the accolades. And thus the work began. Kronan would miss Eyes-Up hanging around, but, helpfully, the big mech had managed to gain a few understudies that would be able to carry out any divinely inspired alterations that Kronan came up with. The pair were called Allbot Eisting, who was known for his exceptional skills with all things bot-related, gargants and the like, and Stepan Squawking, who was known for being under many a console while repairing them, thus he was often stepped on, which then, of course, made him squawk a lot. In any case, they were both working with Newtone and had learned much from him, as they were deep in his counsel, whatever that means. At the very least, they could maintain Kronan's new mobs of cunning mobiles. But let's push on. Anyways, life on the Waaagh fleet had gone steadily forward as Kronan hatched his plans. But Kronan had to absorb the information he had garnered about his enemies, the Smelldar. He went unto his most sacred spot, his Axis Mundi, his chamber of secrets. And he recognized the new setup was quite to his liking, really. For once, not so long ago, Kronan would have a huge amount of grots hanging from the walls in tiny cages, waiting for his use in the dark arts, for these were his thinking grots. Yet, As we have heard last time, he now had a profound appreciation of the little blighters. Not that he was ever above or not understanding of anyone who would rip the head off one for backchat, rudeness, or simply being in the way. But he had to admit the wholesale slaughter of his fellow orcoids for his cogitations seemed so sacrilegious, really. Hence, he instituted a new way of doing things, as he had done so often before. Now, instead of empty floor and chain-festooned walls filled with grot, he had a totally different setup. He walked into his room and marvelled at the new decor, for he had a thin walkway to an elevated centre, steps leading up to a plateau on which stood his most comfy thong. Below him were huge ranks of stools on stone plinths, each a seat for one of 100 grot-sized rumps. And as he sat on his thong, he pulled the lever of summoning. Out of a half-dozen new doors slowly processed a myriad of orderly grots, each clothed from head to toe in robes that delineated their rank and purpose. For it was now known across the entire Waaagh that to step on, thump, snaffle, or smuggle away any of these particular grots would get you an almost instantaneous visit from the Mystery of Truth and Kronan's Black Legion. Each of the grots now stood or sat and looked up at their lord, and he, Kronan, raised his hand into the air, and thus they began. No, no, no. No, no, no. Sang the wee grot, and so it was that the process began. The height, the ambience, the knowledge. And Kronan began. He began to think. For Kronan had indeed also looked up the Smelldar in his data slate, and now was his time to prepare himself for the confrontations to come. He had learned so much of dire import. He now knew of the end times, what the Eldar called the Bananarama. He knew of their main factions also, the Corsairs, as we have heard, but also the Dork Smelldar, the denizens of Kumarag, or something like that. Also the dancing ones, the hardy pins. Kronan suspected their legs must have been hardy indeed for them to perform such acts of acrobatics, but they were not on the menu in this particular scrap, for the Corsairs might also have some of the crafty worlders with them. Not only did they have a magnificent line in scrapbooking, doilies, crochet and knitting, one might presume, but they were also very crafty indeed, which meant that they would be cunning. And Kronan was up for it. Oh, yes he was. There were so many of them as well. Crafty World Same Hand, Crafty World Beer Tang, Crafty World Isanden, Crafty World Ooh-wee, and Crafty World a la TikTok. Yet they seemed close enough to be considered as one, despite how many may have adjusted their war paint between these different cultures of Smelldar. And they were a tragic bunch of oddies again. They had the Fartseers, which Kronan was particularly worried about if truth be told. For now, he had to contend not only with the Emperor potentially watching him crap, but also this bunch of weirdos loitering about whenever he let out a body burp. Not wonderful really, but also, if they could predict the future, it could be tricky to get them to stand still for a good punch in the face. They were the warlogs, understudies of the Fartseers. Presumably they were made of trees, and no doubt good at logs and sticks, but let's avoid all of that, as we have already covered them in a previous sidebar. The Smelldar had so many funny boys, for, like the orcs, every single one of the prancing pricks could be counted on in a scrap, or so the record showed. So at least they had that in common, because Kronan could never understand the humid designation of non-combatant, unless it was to signify the big chest-eared ones, but no matter. These Smelldar were called the Guardy ones. They also had Storm Guardy ones, which was passing odd that they would have specialised boys for a scrap while it was raining, but then it was written mostly by Brits, so that was less of a surprise than one might imagine. And the Smelldar must have feared the rain, as it would probably play havoc with their meticulously arranged hairdos. They had Wind Raiders, which Kronan worried about. They must surely have worked with the Fartseers. But what on Orquilonia would the Smelldar do with all these body exhales? Kronan could not even guess. Flatuthurgy is my own postulation, but moving on. There were the Strangers, who were kicked out of the crafty worlds for some infraction or another. One would imagine it was a dropped loop in a particularly challenging cross-stitch, or something like that. They had Waaargh as well, which did look a bit like the waif units. He supposed that they got their name by their spindly frames, yet they were deemed to be more rugged and macho than any of the other Smelldar forces, according to the Humies at any rate. There were waif guards, waif blades, waif lords, and waif knights, even a waif seer, but that seemed a tad odd. What did those ones do? Hang around looking in the mirror all the time? For they themselves were waifs. The Smelldar seemed so unspeakably silly. They had burp hunters, their equivalent of the ducker jets and bombers of the greenskins. There were rave serpents, where all of the little Smelldar came out as if it were a party. There were fire prisons, which strangely seemed to be concentrated on firepower and not incarceration. The Smelldar were indeed pointless. They could simply not make sense of their own language, it appeared. Then, with the rabble out of the way, Kronan's eyes widened and his maw became juicy as he saw the succulence of the next entries. For the Smelldar did indeed have warriors who thought they were odd. These ones would practice warfare all day and night, and this, Kronan thought, was more like it. They were the arse-picked warriors. There were the growling batshits, and they seemed entirely crazy, as they were the smaller ones, the ones without second noses, but they did look nippy, and those blades of theirs were hardly diddy, very choppy indeed, hence potentially a worthy foe. The dire Revengers were a little uninspiring, but accurate, he guessed. The Dark Heapers were fun as well. He would have to introduce them to his tank busters. The Shiny Spares were also nippy. They rode about on jet bikes and had long stickers that he simply knew would be ouchy. Kronan leered as he thought about what Dacker von Smashhoven would do to their whittle wings of spares. Oh, yes, he did. The swiping dorks and burp spiders were also intended to be deeply tedious, he noted. They could bounce into the skies or the burp and hide where necessary. Thought Kronan. They could be really annoying if he didn't play his cards right. He did read up about some form of scorpions, which sounded cool indeed. Lots of stabbing and poisoning, he thought. But when he read that they like to lounge about while engaging in industrial action, he instantly moved on. Pah! Pathetic. The Fire Dragoons seemed like they might be fun, well, to watch at least. They had melty action in their lances, and this seemed like it would either be hilarious when you got amongst them, or the quickest way to be metamorphosized into a pool of bubbling ick, as tragic violence had been by the Buggins. And Kronan read of Void Beavers and Star or Sky Beavers of the Dancers. Shallow Seers, Death Pesters and Solitaries were amongst them also. But he did not think the Hardy Pins would be involved, so for the present he ignored them. Kronan sat and cogitated. He had so many orcs in his armies. He had many a specialist that he could use to thwart the Smelldar. Krunkelstein was one, but also Grinner. For Kronan had continually thought about that green beam that came from the freebooter's hat. Something was most definitely up with that particular piece of headgear, and Kronan would unpick the riddle and then use the orc boss to his advantage. And so he thought on. And eventually he knew what to do, and that, dear listener, was to take it as it comes. He knew just enough to know, was just about wise enough to know, that he did not know it all. And thus, the war against the pansies was begun. Yet, even as Kronan set off on his sojourn, so too did the first expeditionary fleet, led by Admiral Hackbar. With 16 rocks and a few hundred stair-sheeps of the line, Hackbar flew off in search of the legendary scrap that Kronan had prophesied. While Kronan would claim each and every stair system between Orquilonia and the Bundle, it was Hackbar's job to take his forces and scout ahead. And there, in charge of the hordes of boys stuffed into every nook and cranny of the rocks, sheeps and escorts, was the only orc Kronan could trust with a job. Isaac Newton was working on the secret special job. Madnut Krunkelstein and Ducker von Smashhoven were required for the battle against the Smelldar pirate fleets, of course. So Kronan had to send one of his more naval along to shore up the chain of command and make certain that his instructions were followed to the letter. And much to Kronan's disappointment, he simply could not entrust this mission to any of the others. Hiawafter was barely sentient, Milton John was far too unpopular, and Nog Smasher, who he called Appledon, was as inept as he was violent. And so it was that Kronan finally caved and put one of his best mates in charge of the entire thing. For he had every knowledge that Hackbar may be nominally the titular commander of the fleet, but would need someone to put some fire under his feet to keep him in the action. The gutless wonder indeed. Yet, when the orcs were on the world, had been sent down to prepare for the coming of the Cunning One and the main force, there would need to be a boss of unquestionable loyalty, so that definitely negated Grinner the Backstabber, but also of such phenomenal power that he could maintain order through violence alone. And none other than Gitsquisher McMurder would match up to this near-impossible criteria with the useless wastrels that surrounded him. Now Gitsquisher had a formidable reputation. Had he not commanded a flank in the battle against Toba and his Whiffy forces? Of course he had. But more than this. McMurder had also been in charge of the first contact rituals. Hence, all who had joined the Waaagh after his appointment were already well acquainted with the way he ran things, and more than aware of his fightiness. Also, McMurder had indeed been working on some truly impressive skills while in charge of the rites. He had a backhand slice second to none but Kronan himself, and he was canny enough to know when not to push his luck. Kronan would miss him in tedious meetings, of course, as Gitsquisher would unceremoniously push the button on his arm, and the clang of it falling away from his body always gave everyone a comical laugh when things were getting tiresome. Of course, it was always side-splittingly funny to all when he took said unattached arm and beat someone to death with it if they continued to drone on. Gitsquisher always seemed to know when Kronan was getting bored, and his actions had saved the Cunning One from overexerting himself when he had already invoked the rule of 3 too many times in any deeply grating day. Nor would the fleet not mourn his loss. Well, as much as any orc would. For, between his usual duties, McMurder had become a regular in interviews for the questing adventuring teams who were clearing out the Orcs of Omens. His personal favourite team was, of course, the most popular of them all, and for good reason. For the Slay team were hilarious, and almost impervious to the casualties other parties seemed to suffer. Cannibal, Mad Dog, Mug, Bloody-Eyed Barracudas, and their mascot, the Grot, Carrion, were always the height of carnage and entertainment. Yet even when interviewing other teams, Gitsquisher McMurder was always avuncular and mostly supportive. Well, encouraging is probably more the word really. Supportive sounds more bra-esque, as one can imagine, so that was definitely not it. McMurder was encouraging. Yes, that's more like it. His breakdowns of the events and incisive questions thereafter would be missed by the entire Waaagh, Kronan knew. But needs must when the Squiggoth charges, as Kronan was still trying to get others to say. When they all gathered in the bay to see off old Gitsquisher, Kronan was stoic But Tiddles was crying a tsunami of tears and wailing like a canine that had lost its master. He hadn't, of course, because Kronan was quite evidently and obviously his true master. Yet the gigantic ball of teeth howled like his heart had been broken before he charged out of the bay, taking with him all of the tiny little copies of himself, as a wave of squigs bound after him, also lamenting, though they didn't really know why. And it was then that Kronan stepped forward. In his hands he held a colossal sword of astonishing providence. And Gitsquisher McMurder's jaw dropped. He looked to his big boss, Kronan, and then back at the blade, as Kronan held it out to him. McMurder knew that this was not a permanent gift. No, this would forever be the blade of the Cunning One, for it was gifted to him by their guard, Mork himself. Hence, this was an honor beyond honors, for the Cunning One, Kronan, was tasking him to take it and draw first blood with it. He would be the very herald of Kronan. But the gift came with a mountainously suffocating weight of responsibility, for it meant that, by taking it, McMurder would be agreeing to give it back. A boulder of duty was placed upon him, one he could never escape from under until he had indeed returned the blade to Kronan, for it meant that he had to survive to do this. He could not throw caution to the wind and join the front lines. He could not get involved in the place he loved to be most, the deepest, messiest centre of any fray. Yet he could not deny his lord, his boss, his leader. Gitsquisher took the weapon in his hands, which dropped quite a bit actually, because Kronan was such a strapping big boy. He made everything look so easy, and so, well, did he really? But the weight of the weapon was far more than McMurder was used to. Another minor little inconvenience. Without months of practice, there was no way on Orquilonia that McMurder could wield this huge bastard of a chopper, the first chopper or no. Hence, he could not be painting himself blue and charging into the enemy with it at any time soon. Kronan had hog-tied McMurder like a festive spit roast. Now, some might say, crumbs, is McMurder that clever to have fathomed all of that in the one go? Well, it is regularly known that the head is often more capable than the heart. Or was it the other way round? In any case, the actual realization of the duty did indeed only dawn on him as time went on. Yet this was only the frontal cortical stimulation that was the justification and realization of what his heart had heard all too well. He knew this to be true ever before he understood it. Thus did Kronan grant him great honor by handing him Hacknien, the first chopper, signaling that he was the very hand of the Cunning One, and none on this small excursion, this scouting force, could even conceive of challenging McMurder's supremacy. But then, Gitsquisher was not a name he took lightly either. He liked to reinforce the name as much as it just came by nature. Hence, McMurder was meaty, fighty, and bitey enough to cow all resistance anyways. The weapon, the first chopper, was a signal. It was a sign. It was also a perfectly good reason for Kronan to make bloody well sure he did follow up old McMurder, just to get his holy artifact back. Hence, it was also a sort of promise from the big boss to his warrior. Yes, I will be back for this. So rest assured, you are not some expendable like the Grots are. Ha ha. But of course, nobody else would give any gifts. Nobody else would part with any of their hard-earned bling or booty to another. Hence was the prophecy fulfilled and the legend of Kronan enriched. For noblesse oblige was indeed the expectation of the king. In this case, that was inarguably Kronan, and he acted like one. More simply put, only a true king gives his stuff out a bit, because he's got to show how much he already has, eh? Hackbar was given a glare and a nod by the Cunning One. He didn't mind, most knew. All Hackbar really cared about were those beings hiding around corners or in the shadows, ready to jump out on him, a weirdo. But such is life, that it takes so many forms and faces to make the sum greater than the whole of the parts. Or something like that. Either way, Kronan did not trudge after they had all watched the shuttle head over to the gutless wonder, Hackbar's flagship. He strode with purpose. The forward scout fleet was prepared and heading out. In the distance, Kronan felt he could even begin to see the new thing worked on. But of course, this was a flight of fancy. He was millions of miles away from the incredibly rich mineral asteroid belts that were its present home, being built as close to the source of materials as possible. Kronan really did want at least one before the main event, yet he left them to work in peace. He had bigger fish to fry, as the Toe Empire hate to hear, but hear it they must. For this was even more popular a saying since Ramalama Ding Dong 4 than his own needs must when the Squiggoth charges thing. Even though most had not taken part in the butchery of the blue thingies, the liar cast, or something like that. Well, the entire Waaagh had seen the footage, so pretending it would not stick around was not really on the menu, unless Kronan struck the combat footage from the massacre of the Toe Boys from the VidNet. And even with the mystery of truth and the entirety of his Black Legion, even Kronan was not unwise enough to pee directly into the faces of his own adherents or fans by doing that. Moving swiftly on, Hackbar and McMurdo now corralled their forces together, then ripped a huge tear into the burp, and off they went. Now, Hackbar was no stellar cartographer, and none were any of his boys. Hence, it had been agreed with, well, or directed by pain to be inflicted by the cunning one, that they go as long as they could, then popped out of the burp and have a shufty around. Kronan was very specific about what they were looking for. It had to be a Humi system. There would be arse starters, imperious gravy, anal mini tantrum, and entire odors of the Adipi The smaller marines, with the white hair and the big ears under their torso armor. Those ones. For Kronan had known their ways, had marked their passing. Or so, he had read standing orders to hightail it to this system without delay. But in any case, McMurdo and Hackbar were instructed to watch out for anyone or anything that displayed the banners of the Departamento Mini Horum, as they were likely to be able to stop the fighting somehow. Okay, Kronan was not sure how either Hackbar or McMurdo were to discern these potentially killjoy filth, yet they were forewarned, and thus forearmed. Which is a bit of a silly statement, really, because you don't really need prior knowledge to go outside with your arms on your torso now, do you? Upper or lower? No, because that would be silly. So why being warned would help with any of this was anyone's guess. Yet it was part of the dialectic Mosmeorum, thus it had to stand. And so it was that Kronan finished his immediate work, and then went off in search of Tiddles. For he had not seen the Avatar of Teeth since he charged out of the bay in floods of tears, the soppy old sod. Now Kronan knew that McMurdo had been ingratiating himself with a ball of dental fury with tidbits, especially tasty grots and the like. Now Kronan did initially think that McMurdo was trying to slick the palm of Tiddles, in the hopes of one day trying to take out the cunning one while he slept, or something like that. You know, the old I bribed the guard doggies with sweetmeats affair. But no. This is not that kind of tale, and the orcs are not that sort of bunch. Because no orc, bar that wretched bucket of vomit Toba, would ever want to take power via anything other than watching the light die in the previous boss's eyes while they stood over them victorious. After an epic scrap, of course, but that part is practically a waste of time to actually state, and to keep adding. Sorry. So Kronan wrote off his suspicions as some form of weirdness, coming from reading his data slate a bit too often as of late. His mind almost being infected with the wimpy thoughts of the lesser races. He would have to watch for that in the future. Hence, Kronan knew that it was just because Gitsquisher and Tiddles had a real bond. Not one as established as betwixt master and pet, but one blooming up to the level of first cousin who turns up every weekend for a sleepover and likes the family pet type terrain. Or so, because Gitsquisher did not have a pet of his own, which Kronan always thought was ludicrous. So he might have just been filling in that urge while remaining ostensibly unfettered, untied down, with the responsibility of owning his own. Yet Kronan was now wending his way in pathways he had never trodden before. Yes, it was because he was a strapping lad, and these smaller, dingier tunnels were cramped and rather low for his prodigious girth and height, but also because it was where the lower orcoids dwelt. Squigs, snots and grots, that lot. Kronan ripped a lumen off the wall to gain more visual acuity, yet it predictably went off as soon as it was separated from its housing, with a customary shower of sparks, of course. Kronan could not see well at all, and he hated squinting, so he grabbed a bundle of cloth from the ground and quickly fired it with his backup surprise hand burner. Alas, there was some squealing from the bundle of cloth, but Kronan paid it no mind, as the struggling made the reflected light more interesting, and of course, the shouting in agony did calm his nerves in such an unfamiliar locale. Probably a snot, mused Kronan for about 2.3 nanoseconds before moving on. And Kronan searched the underdecks of the Orcs of Omen, not too deeply, as that might have him bump into one of the adventuring parties that still stalked the inner corridors. And although a surprise massacre by the cunning one might be hilarious on the short term, on the long, it might not do to total party kill a famous gang via death by Kronan, and it was not precisely the kind of fame Kronan needed at the present. For now, more than ever, there would need to be a slowing of the self-crumping in the fleet. They were engaging the Smelldar, after all, which we will get to, I promise. And so it was that Kronan stalked the dark and dank deep rooms and tunnels. Now he witnessed more and more scrawls across the walls, for these were performed quite obviously by the snots, for the blood-daubed frescoes were too low to the ground to be orcs or even grots. And Kronan stopped for a second, as he thought of how he really should put a stop to the intersheep origlotomy displays. But he shrugged. Life could not be too easy for the wee grots. They needed their trials as well, if they were to be as fighty as he required, as he desired. Thus, the catching of the test pieces, i.e. the grots, would keep them on their toes, avoiding the runt herds when they came out with their bags. And anyways, there were not that many runt herds that were at the level to compete in the games and display of skill. The grots had it pretty good under his new regime. Oh, yes they did. Well, apart from when Madnut Krunkelstein believed he could perform mech stuff as well as all but eye sting, Krunkelstein had proposed that the use of grots could power the sheeps and make them faster. Alas, even when he shoveled 10,000 grots into a furnace in one day, there was no marked change in the velocity of the test vessel. Ergo, he was talking utter tosh. This was, of course, the last time anyone listened to Madnut when he was utterly pie-eyed and 3 sheets to the wind on grog. And Kronan did almost consider correlating that the level of good counsel compared to utter bollocks spouted was somehow intrinsically linked to the amount of booze the weird boy had consumed. Go figure. Anyways, Kronan lurked and stalked in the darkness, and he saw the markings the snots had made on the walls. Now most seemed to be an excellently religious devotional, for there were many images that were unmistakably Gork and Mork. More Mork, of course, as this was his Waaagh. Yet there appeared another image amongst them all. 2, in fact. One was again, unmistakably, the cunning one, Kronan, which was good and right, for was he not the prophet of Mork? Of course he was. But there was also Tiddles, and his depictions were a tad on the large side for Kronan's liking, and as he walked on, he saw that the scrawls from earlier were probably older, and as he got deeper into the darkness, the newer murals were going apace. yet the prominence and colour of the pictures had changed. The adored bloody frescoes of the Orb of Teeth were getting larger, and Kronan could see that there was another light flickering at the end of a long alley come walkway. He quietly snuck up and peered inside. And there he was. There was Tiddles, sat on a huge collection of cushions. Well, Kronan hoped they were cushions, as otherwise they were snots, and they were allowing him to sit on them, which meant some would invariably snuff it under the pressure. Around Tiddles were also Squigs, of course. He rarely went anywhere without a congregation of the little balls of hate, but now they were joined by Snots, and the Snots knelt on the ground and raised their hands over their heads and then moved them onto the ground, bending their bodies to prostrate themselves on the floor. They were not just idolizing, not just paying homage or deference. They were praying to Tiddles, the Avatar of Teeth. And Kronan did not know how to feel about any of this. On the one hand, there were only two gods, Gork and Mork. This was known. Yet, were there others? Had the Greenskins been lied to about their entire culture, their entire history? For even Kronan had to admit, were it not for his excellent chronicler, then none would truly know of his tale in the future, and he had never heard of another boss having one. Go, that word again, eh? He worried that perhaps the Orcs had always had more gods, and had just forgotten. Perhaps there was one for the Grot. Perhaps, just perhaps, Tiddles was indeed the Avatar of Teeth. Was he actually the prophet of the Squig god? Did they have one? Kronan trudged on, deep in thought. Then he stopped, and a sneaky bellow of body burp erupted from his poo pouch unbidden. The tight gantries and tunnels really concentrated the bouquet, and Kronan had tears of mirth coming down as he could not escape his own flatus. And he could see why the Black Legion despised him expelling his grunts into the outer chamber before heading into bed. Sniggering for the next half hour or more, Kronan headed up to the far less weird or challenging region of the ship that was populated by his own kind, the Orcs. All spiritual considerations now gone, washed away in the tears of his mirth. And of course, it was then that the klaxons flared up again, and all of the lumens on the ship turned red. They were under attack again. Well, probably not the Orcs of Omen itself, but outlier elements of the escorts at the least. And Kronan ran to the bridge to enjoy the hilarity. He did so love shouting, "Fire!" It was somehow life-enriching to see so much Daka released after his one-worded order. Now this is what being a boss was all about, the Daka. And so it was that Kronan leapt through the doors of the bridge as soon as they were opened wide enough, then bounced up the stairs towards his golden command song. Lights and shapes, chevrons and icons of a dizzying myriad appeared before the cunning one as he flipped on the noosphere battle schematics. The fop was at it again. A small sortie of Smelldar ships was now harassing the edges of his fleet. Grandmouth Tartan was already acting to contain as many sheeps as possible, bellowing at them to hold course and fire when the Smelldar came in close enough, and that's it. Yet the juicy opportunity for a scrap was so difficult to resist. And Kronan face-palmed comedically to Tartan as they both saw a gaggle of kill cruisers and brute ships head off after a picket passing harassing Smelldar. A puff of fumes came from one of the sheeps, and it was clear to see that they had dropped their bomber and fighter wings to engage with the pansies. Alas, this was always a crap plan. For as studious as Daka von Smashoven had been in their tutelage, the fly boys were still utterly rubbish out there. The Smelldar escorts dipped behind the shadow of a moon, and it didn't take Mork's own cunning to figure out what was coming next. And practically on cue, out plopped a set of Smelldar fighter pilots. They danced and weaved around Kronan's fighters, Outnumbered at least 5 to 1 as they were, yet their speed, agility, and accuracy meant that the Smelldar were darting in and out of von Smashoven's fighter wings and pulling them apart in detail. Yet, Kronan was now a bit better versed in this situation than of late, and Tartan was getting properly exercised, as this had been the 3rd raid today, and today was a slow one. As the kill cruisers caught up with the swiftly diminishing Orky fighters, the Smelldar did not even peel off and scarper as usual. It seemed that their amount of orcs was getting to the enemy. They used to be satisfied with just stripping off some fighters and maybe cutting up a few escorts per raid. Yet, as more sheep of the Waaagh had made it through the burp and arrived at the new muster points, the Smelldar must have realized that their pinprick stings were simply not doing anything to cease the greenskin onward rush. And things had not all gone the Smelldar's way either, for Kronan and Tartan had identified the regions they most often came from, most often retreated towards. Okay, the crafty Smelldar had wandered them down many a dead end and, of course, a set-piece slaughter. Yet, the Waaagh had pushed into some systems and just rushed for habitable planets or asteroid belts where the scallywags might be hiding. Then the collected fleet would simply bombard the place with Daka from many hundreds of ships. Inexorably, some of the dainty Eldar vessels or bases were there, and scrap missions had always chortled hard when they did find the remains of Smelldar sheep, bases, or floating decompressed bodies. Hence, these seemingly minor events to the Eldar were huge morale victories for the greenskins, and it certainly kept them in the fight. And so it was that the Smelldar cutters that buzzed the fleet were not running, but turning on their pursuers and slicing some up with their deadly rays of heat and death. Yet, one of the enemy's sheep was caught between 2 Orky vessels they had smashed, only to be jumped on by a good Orky ram ship. The smaller Orky vessel was mostly shorn in half by the nimbly reacting Smelldar. Joy of joys, though. The remaining half of the brute ram ship half dug into the nippy Smelldar sheep and disgorged its contents. That being a payload of deeply angry and very fighty boys, and few Smelldar sheep could survive such a boarding. Kronan grinned a cunning leer as he thought of the carnage that must be ensuing on near every deck, stairwell and bay of the Smelldar sheep. It was glorious. He was almost jealous when he then ordered the Orcs of Omen to fire its long-range missiles into the escaping Smelldar cutter. Oh, they would get away most often, but 1 in 5 of those who were shot at by this level of missiles at this proximity? It was in the lap of the gods, of course, but Kronan grinned again, and even more wolfishly, as 2 missiles of the wave slammed into the second Smelldar sheep and transformed it into a lovely plume of multicolored fire. And the rest of the Orky kill cruisers caught up to the boarded Smelldar sheep and sent over more boys to help out. Their fighters, having nowhere to run to and nowhere to hide, would end their days taking out as many of the Orc jets as possible. Or so Kronan thought. Yet, all the greenskins knew, as they would hold the space after the engagement and could thus salvage anything left behind, he knew that all of his own fighters and bombers would be almost instantly replaced. It was one of the tasks he had given specifically to Stepan Squawking to maintain and increase the flight wings. And then, on the very edges of detection range, a lone fighter appeared. Again. Dipping in and out of detection range, it was the Smelldar fighter Ace, the ones the Orkies called, the cast iron Bast. For his fighter was smooth and metallic, unpainted and grim. Well, for a Smelldar vehicle anyways. It glittered in the distance, forever beckoning, forever just out of range. The self-same cast iron that had been witnessed to take out scores of Orky flyboys in engagements. The self-same cast iron Bast that had used precision shooting to cripple a half-dozen sheep of the line, even smashing the bridge of 1 kill cruiser and mauling it so badly that it was practically scrap. And all now looked at Daka as Smashhoven then looked up at Kronan. again. Now Kronan knew exactly what was going on. The boss of the Winds of Waaagh did this every single time that this particular fighter ace came into the scopes. He would just stop everything he was doing and just stare up at Kronan. He did not cross his hands over his chest. He did not tut. He did not whine, moan, or complain. He simply looked up at the cunning one. And every single time, Kronan utterly ignored him. He did it so well that he was never ever caught looking down, even in the region that Daka stood. Never. But now, could he do it? Because it was at this moment that the fleet saw what they had done so many times before. As the cast iron blast now sped towards the furball that was almost wrapping up, and he was on them in a minute, weaving between streams of good orky Daka, turning impossibly in space and eviscerating those chasing him, before then flipping around again and hunting down stragglers, or even entire groups of 3 or 4 orky pilots. Each pass he killed 1, then 2, of von Smashoven's flyboys. He was tearing the entire formation to pieces, and slicing them up like a kebab chef with a line of customers out of the door. It was utter carnage. Yet, Kronan did not look down at the stock-still boss of the Winds of Waaagh. Now, Kronan was not actually averse to losing some of his boys, no matter the station. Oh, he would miss the camaraderie, of course, but as no truly orky orc fears death, there was no situation where they did not at least consider the casualties would be left behind on the battlefield. For Waaagh had its price, and it was a price the orcs would pay with a smile on their lips and a song in their hearts, or something like that. Yet, to lose Daka now did seem to be such a huge waste of talent, for none of the other flyboys came even close to the skill and ability of Daka von Smashoven, something Daka had proven himself in great detail, as he had previously been in a few sorties of his own, and Kronan had never stopped him then. And von Smashoven, despite what anyone might say about the orcs, was a greenskin in a trillion. He was a genuine genius when it came to flying, and he had even shot down 5 Smelldar fighters in the last month, which was the highest in the entire fleet by 4. To be a fighter ace amongst the cunning Waaagh, it was only required to kill 1 Smelldar fighter, which previously would have been a surprise, but the Smelldar were actually quite good at fighting, mused Kronan often. Oh, they were useless in most other regards, with all their crafting and dancing and crying and poetry. But, thought Kronan, when push came to shove, they weren't half bad at void warfare. Now, this may be just because he had not really seen them in combat in other arenas, but the proof of the pudding is always in the tasting, as they say, and few boarding actions had not met with success. Hence, they were certainly not as choppy or stabby as they were good in a pilot's cockpit, whatever that was. And the cast iron bast was having a whale of a time, Kronan could see, as each pass saw more of the chevrons of his own fighters disappear. And still, Daka stood. Still, Daka von Smashoven stared. And Kronan sighed. If Daka was blasted out of the darkness by this cast-iron bast, then who on Orquilonia would train his new flyboys? Who would keep them in check? For even other speed freaks were barely similar to the flyboys, and every time one was put in charge of a flyboy wing, they were either killed in uprisings or got their entire squadron slaughtered on the first engagement. Daka von Smashoven was too important to Kronan and the entire Waaagh. Yet, this could not go on forever. And Kronan was not wrong. He could feel it. He could see it out of the corner of his eyes. And today was the tipping point. Today, it mattered. For today, it was not just Daka von Smashoven. As one after another of the bridge crew now stood at their stations, they were not looking at their screens and data screens. It was like an infection of the ick. It had passed from one bridge underboss to the next. And now, for the first time, Even the screaming of Grand Mouth Tartan could not quell the event. They all did as they were instructed, but then immediately, after this action had been performed, they returned to looking up at Kronan. All of them. They just bogged at him. Dramatically, some might slowly slip their view to darker, waiting at the base of the stairs to Kronan's thong, then return their view to Kronan. It was not narrowed-eyed of rage or contempt. Of course not. It was not eyes looking at him in scorn. No one would dare. The closest Kronan could place it to was the same wide-eyed imploring that he had seen on the face of Tiddles before the assault of Ramalama Ding Dong 4. They were all imploring him. The cast-iron blast flew dramatically through the wreckage of its last kill, like something from a 70s sci-fi, then escorted the last Smelldar fighter with him and headed out to beyond detection range again. Near all now looked at their screens again, their heads all solemnly and slowly returning to their work. None now looked up, bar one, bar him. And Kronan knew. He remembered the lessons of the Squig games. He understood his people. This could not go on another day. It could not, or he would lose him. He had seen it before. When an orc was prevented from crumping, was denied their very birthright, it killed something inside of them. So Kronan was without choice. If he did not let Daka do what he did best, Kronan would kill him, as surely as a blast through the windscreen with a macro cannon blast. A slow and pathetic death. And Kronan could not do that. So, Kronan moved from his golden thong and brought himself up to his full height as he walked down the stairs. At the very bottom, he turned and looked down into the face of Daka von Smashhoven and said one word. Just the one. Tomorrow. Daka von Smashhoven bowed to the Cunning One as the bridge exploded into paroxysms of undiluted joy and cheering. Kronan went back to his chambers to plan his next moves, yet, even before he got there, the news was out. Whispered from sheep to sheep, Kronan was pretty much sure that every last greenskin in the fleet would know by the time he had finished his repast. And he was not wrong. But he was slightly miffed when his din-dins was disrupted, for he did like to sample the vid displays while eating. But, of course, the mood swiftly passed. The show he was watching cut out. Blackness. Then, vids of the cast iron blast were streaming across the entire fleet, across his screen. Then, suddenly, the screen went black again. Then a single sigil appeared on the screen, with a green orky flag fluttering in the background. It was a sigil of the Winds of Waaagh, the icon of Daka von Smashhoven. Kronan could hear the screams of adulation from his black legion just outside. He knew the selfsame screams were erupting aboard every stair sheep in the fleet. They really did not like this cast-iron blast for certain. And who doesn't like a grudge match, a Rwengi killing spree? Nobody worthy of the mention, that's who. Well, that was that. If the cast-iron blast turned up tomorrow, it was on. There was now nothing Kronan could do to stop it, as every last greenskin in the fleet went into anticipation mode. To be continued. And so, gentle listener, another return to old form as I ask you to forge the narrative. It's vote time. Hit the comments with your vote, but please put it at the top of your comment. If possible, any commentary should be in a separate entry, because it simply makes it easier to read the votes when the time comes, which won't be as long this time. So, you choose. Forge the narrative. Option 1. Daka von Smashhoven is just an orc. He is talented, but he is biting off more than he can chew. He challenges who the orcs called the Cast Iron Blast, but this is actually a legendary Eldar fighter pilot named Adrin and Gao. the Death Bird. Option 1. Daka gets blown out of the sky, and Kronan has to find a new boss for the Flyboys. Option 2. Daka von Smashhoven is everything his lord requires, and he blows this Adarin Angaur out of the skies, proving that it is not only the Eldar who have the gods with them this day. Option 2. Daka kills the Eldar. Option 3. Daka is good, but Adarin Angaur is his equal, and both snuff it in a mid-void collision. Option 3. Both die. So, please write down options 1, 2, or 3 and help to forge the narrative. And I can assure you, the results will be in faster the more votes I can winkle out of you. Forge the narrative, you decide. See you all soon, and thank you for your precious time. Now, no matter what you do today, do try to make some time for fun. Toodaloo.